Okay, so now we're going to look at the different sources of international law and how it kind of comes to influence domestic laws. So we know we had before this the UN Charter of Rights, the UN Charter 1945, which kind of created the UN, so imagine that's here. From there, though, the biggest thing was the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This was the first time we had a large-scale global definition and recognition of human rights, okay? However, remember, the UDHR wasn't enforceable. Countries didn't ratify it and also, in Australia's case, enact it. Because remember, Australia doesn't only need to ratify a treaty, it needs to ratify and then also enact it for it to become a part of our domestic legislation. So, from there, we made the ICCPR and the ICSCR, which gave rise to different other multilateral and bilateral treaties, which then have become domestic legislation. Okay, so you can see how the UDHR really was the initial step or the initial stepping stone toward further not only promotion but enforcement of human rights. So if you're asked about the influence of the UDHR or a formal statement of human rights on the development of human rights, I would pick the UDHR and basically outline that while it wasn't enforceable, it gave rise to enforceable pieces of legislation, which definitely have had an effect in a significant amount of states. Potentially not all states, well, actually not all states. As I said, we know China doesn't respect some human rights. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that the ICCPR, the ICSCR, and the UDHR are irrelevant and didn't have any good effect. They still had a very significant good effect. They were limited in some regard, though. Okay, so looking at all of these more specifically, the UDHR, as I said, came after the UN Charter 1945. It was drawn up in 1948 following the establishment of the UN. As I said, human rights have always existed, but only applied in esoteric and narrow capacities. Okay, so states basically didn't really recognize human rights. However, after the atrocities of World War I and World War II, it served as a catalyst for us all to come together and say, all right, we actually really need to protect human rights. Unlike the UN Charter in 1945, the UDHR specifically defined all our human rights and freedoms. We voted on the UNGA and from its inception has brought together expressions of a wide range of rights. So the UN General Assembly, okay, where all states come together and basically work towards solving global human rights breaches. Okay, so these are the different areas that the UDHR protects. So life, liberty, thought and expression, religion, education and work. And it has now become international customary law because it's not binding. Okay, the effectiveness is that it carries enormous moral weight. It's adopted by the majority of the international community. The fact that the UDHR is soft law encouraged the maximum number of countries to sign up, meaning that because there wasn't really an onus on these countries to necessarily enact this legislation in their own domestic legislation, they were quick to say, yeah, we'll join. And it's an aspirational declaration, okay? It's something to work towards because obviously in a lot of places, human rights aren't fully protected. And areas of ineffectiveness is that, as I said, it isn't technically legally binding. It's considered soft law. Okay, the twin covenants, okay? ICCPR, ICSCR. They were developed in 1966, but they didn't come into force until 1976. They were established to enforce the rights in the UDHR and make it legally binding on nation states. The twin covenants are considered as hard law because they're binding. It's a binding treaty. And with the UDHR, ICCPR, ICSCR, and the UN Charter, we make up the International Bill of Rights. Okay, so areas of effectiveness for these twin covenants. They've inspired over 200 international treaties and conventions. Don't underestimate that, okay? I know it's just one dot point and you can think, oh, okay, just one dot point. That is a significant achievement. They are binding and enforceable, and they have been enforced in many states, okay, which have protected many people from human rights breaches. Ineffectiveness, though. The notion of human rights are sometimes said to be Eurocentric. So we kind of need to work towards the idea that human rights should not be culturally specific. So the definition of human rights in the UDHR, is sometimes criticized in that it's Eurocentric, and human rights, or things that we believe to be human rights in more Western countries, aren't necessarily seen to be human rights in Eastern countries, and vice versa. State sovereignty still stands in the way of international law being truly enforceable. Remember, state sovereignty is the idea that a state can make laws and rules regarding its own property and its own people without external interference, okay? Which of course stands in the way of enforcement of human rights and the effectiveness of the ICCPR and the ICSCR, because states can choose to not enact it or not ratify it, or they can choose to ratify it but not agree to it. And a lot of the time, nothing really is done. The power of veto that exists in the UN Security Council limits efforts to enforce these covenants. Because a lot of the time when there's a conflict happening, certain states with veto power, so remember that's France, the US, England, China, and Russia, one of them will veto it. For example, in the Syrian conflict, China and Russia vetoed taking any power against it because that was kind of at odds with their financial gain they got from that conflict. Okay, so the ICCPR has to do with civil and political rights, such as the right to life, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and the right to a fair trial. It has the aim of protecting people from the arbitrary use of government power, so authoritarianism or totalitarianism. Governments can't just come and suppress your rights. They're first generation rights, and 172 countries have signed, excluding China and Saudi Arabia. Okay, so countries can pick parts they don't follow or they don't agree in following. Okay, what does this mean? Basically, we have revisions of the ICCPR for every state, meaning that if Australia gets the ICCPR and they say, all right, we like this, we can agree to all these human rights, but we don't want to protect that human right. They can basically agree to everything else in the ICCPR, but not that right, okay? Which sounds a bit crazy because it's like, why wouldn't you protect all the human rights? But the idea of the UN in allowing this is at least the other rights will still be protected. Of course, it's still bad that we're able to have provisions where certain human rights are taken out and aren't ratified into domestic law. It still enables the protection of some human rights, okay? So the big issue with human rights in Australia, one of the big issues, we have two. We have two main ones. Firstly, we have the rights of Indigenous people that need to be protected more strongly, such as increased self-determination, okay, or increased protection of self-determination. And then the other one is torture, okay? So Australia has detention centres where basically people who, a lot of people who, like people, smugglers and things like that, they're fleeing conflict or environmental crises, and they arrive in boats to Australia. Australia basically will send these people to detention centres. And oftentimes, most of the time, 99.999% of the time, these detention centres have very, very, very horrible conditions, like extremely horrible. A few years ago, a man, I believe, set himself on fire to kind of send a message of how bad life is in these detention centres, okay? And Australia has been heavily criticised for not protecting those people's human rights and in fact, breaching their human rights by forcing them to live in such horrible conditions. There are even quotes of these people outright saying that they wouldn't have come because living in these detention centers is worse than living back home, which is horrible. Okay, now the ICSCR, this has to do with economic, social, and cultural rights. Okay, so the right to work in jobs that are freely chosen or accepted, the right to remuneration, I'm not even going to try and repronounce that allows a decent living, the right to form and join trade unions, the right to social security. It has the aim of upholding people's quality of life and livelihood. It's a second generation right, meaning that you need political rights first to be able to develop your economic, social, and economic, social, and cultural rights. 160 countries have signed. China, again, Saudi Arabia have not. Also, Singapore has not. And it's monitored by the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Okay, so this is something that I thought I would include in here as a little practice question that you could do, or maybe like a thought bubble, and just kind of brainstorm your response in your own time. But it's a nice question to get us thinking about how we can apply everything we just went over. So, in your opinion, how and to what extent have these major international documents contributed to the modern day development of human rights? Okay, so UDHR, UN Charter of 1945, ICCPR, ICSCR. It's a good little revision activity for what we've just done.